Anti-Gravity Room, we're going around the world in 24 minutes.
That's right, from Japan to South Africa, there's a lot of cool stuff out there. I'm Phil in Toronto, and we have interviews with Garth Ennis, Fantagraphics, and Carl Masek coming up.
And I am still Nick in New York. We've got a ton of anime like Ghost in the Shell in this episode, so all you otaku, stay tuned to the Anti-Gravity Room.
In Japan, anime and manga are the terms for animation and comic books. There once was a manga cyberpunk anime epic called Ghost in the Shell. It was turned into anime, kicked butt in Japan, and now is hitting North American theaters on a limited release. Marvin Gleicher of Manga Entertainment discusses this Japanese invasion.
Well, when people ask me what is anime, it's really an abbreviation for animation, but very stylized. The characters have more development in them, more animation flowing and movement. It has more intricate backgrounds, and the plot is definitely more intricate than a regular westernized animation that you would see on a Saturday morning cartoon show or even in a feature film. Ghost in the Shell is our major theatrical release this year. It's a full-length featured Japanese animation, very highly stylized, and it stars a gorgeous woman who is really a cyber life form that was created to perform espionage into other people's computers and in cyberspace to gather data and information to spy on weapons and other countries' plans. And she escapes and is looking for a human biological life form so that she can disappear into the background.
Chief, the puppet master's gone. What in God's name? Shut the defense walls now, damn it!
One of the main characters is Major Kusanagi, and she's really a cybernetic person. The only original human part left of her is her brain. And in her quest to find this cybernetic life form, the puppet master, she questions her own existence and whether she's really human or not, since most of her body parts, in fact all other than her brain, have been replaced. And she is in charge of the team of Special Police Force to find the puppet master. Bato is one of Major Kusanagi's specialized agents, and he is more like a Rutger Hauer type character that is a real tough and is very experienced in these types of covert operations. The director, Mamuro Oshii, has created a digital generated animation, which is his theory of animation created by images and memory. It's a combination of cell animation, effects, and computer-generated graphics. Some of the scenes that utilize these techniques are the scene inside of the marketplace where they think they've spotted the puppet master and tracked her down. There's also the scenes, there's a classic fight scene that occurs in the streets where an invisible puppet master is fighting against the security forces, and this film has done extremely well in the East. In more Western civilization, in the United States and in Europe, the film has been received with rave reviews, and it seems to be appealing to a more mass audience than any Japanese animation film has done in the past. This could be the biggest Japanese animation film in the world.
Sure, manga is cool and everything, but what makes it different from North American comics? Scott McCloud, author of Understanding Comics, fills us in.
Hi, I'm Scott McCloud, author of Understanding Comics, and today we're going to be talking about Japanese comics, or manga as they're known, and how they evolved. Unlike American comics, which evolved from many different sources and many different artistic influences, Japanese comics evolved primarily from one single artist, a man named Osamu Tezuka, who began making comics in 1945 and continued through 4 decades and 150,000 pages. He influenced most of the major comics artists working today, and he helped found an industry which is now the most successful comics industry in the world. The key to manga's incredible success is in its approach to storytelling. Manga artists employ a host of techniques which are designed specifically to involve the reader, to make the reader feel like a participant in the story, not just an observer. For example, Japanese comics have always been more cartoony than their European and American counterparts. But this isn't just an arbitrary stylistic choice. This is because they've discovered a very important power in art, the power of simplicity. Sometimes a few simple lines can more effectively describe a character than a more detailed rendering, because it allows the readers to fill in the blanks. Just a circle, 2 dots, and a line can be enough to trigger a mental response, which not only tells us that there's a face there, but also feels more like our own face. It's a more personal sort of identity, and Japanese comics often get very close to that line. Another important technique that helps manga artists to stimulate reader involvement is their revolutionary approach to motion. Unlike their American and European counterparts, Japanese artists offer a very subjective view of motion, one that allows the readers to feel as if they're moving just as fast as anything in the picture. Today's popular Japanese comics, the ones that have been translated in America, like Ranma 1/2, Akira, or Lone Wolf and Cub, bear little resemblance to Tezuka's work, but they still have his influence deep inside them. And really, they're like leaves on a tree that you can follow back through the branches and down to the trunk. That trunk is Osamu Tezuka.
So we want to know, what foreign comics do you read?
My favorite international comic would probably have to be Tintin. I, as a kid, grew up with him, and I still read them to this very day.
My favorite international comic is Asterix, and even now I still read it every once in a while because I almost have the whole collection.
I love manga, and I especially can't wait for the Ghost in the Shell movie release.
My favorite international comic is Astro Boy, by far.
When we come back, Phil with CD-ROM reviews and some global cuisine at the International House of Pancakes. Cringe-tastic.
All right, this week we're reviewing Crazy Ivan for what? The Sony PlayStation. And listen to this. It's much like Kiliak, the DNA Imperative. Remember that game? It's a shooter game, much like Doom. But the thing is, Crazy Ivan's more refined. It looks a lot better. Plus, there's nothing like popping a game in and seeing presented in Dolby Surround, because I have the 5-speaker home theater thing happening. I cranked this baby up. The sound is awesome. The graphics are a lot more refined than Kiliak, like I said. And the opening of the game actually is pretty good. No bad acting. Now, as you go up the different levels, you get to change countries. You start off in Russia. You can eventually end up in Japan. You can end up in North America and New York. You can end up in Saudi Arabia. And the terrain is much the same as you'd expect from these countries. A little bit of a tip, though. Like, in the first level, for example, you get into a certain arena. Now, there are 4 arenas, and then there's a certain item you have to pick up, okay? Now, pick up all your things at the arenas and get out of there, because if you don't keep moving, the Black Knight will come, which is this huge robot, and it'll blow you away, and then you got to keep going over and over again. Crazy Ivan, I have to give it 4.5 Gs out of 5. Why do I take off the half G? Because Psygnosis, the guys who came up with this game, I know they're going to come up with an even better shooter game. Crazy Ivan, check it out.
This just in. Vertigo and Peter Cooper present The System. Corrupt cops, serial killers, crazed bombers, and political scandal are the focus of this 3-part miniseries. Indie Magazine issue number 14 is now available, featuring the UK comic scene and interviews with Billy Tucci, Xander Cannon, and Bud Root. Big Entertainment and Alliance Television are turning John Jake's Mulkin Empire into a TV series. Mulkin Empire was a 6-issue limited series released last year. No food, no water. What comics would you like on a desert island?
If I could take 3 comics onto a desert island, I would take Bone, Scud, and Bone.
Stick around as we continue to cruise the global village with Garth Ennis and Fantagraphics, plus some South African comic strips after this.
Where's that baby? I brought you a little...
Hey, what's up, fellow tourists to Earth? I am Nick, and this is Comicopia, my weekly 35 squared minutes of low-fat fun with the latest comics. This week, I'm checking out international comics. So first up is the super independent book, Underwater number 5, from the Great White North, eh? In this issue, well, it's kind of hard to tell. You see, Underwater is written in a strange, different language, and I'm not talking Latin. The people of Underwater communicate in a language only understood by themselves and Chester Brown, the creator. The concept is not to slack off on writing, but to have you, the reader, slowly understand this odd gibberish. This comic is fun if you attempt to decode it, or even try to say some of the words out loud. What shoe is he bought? Whether this is a comic masterpiece or just a big joke, it's still pretty cool, and I give it 3.5 out of 5 Gs on the anti-gravity scale. Next up, I want Lori Petty, because this is Tank Girl, the craziest Australian since Crocodile Dundee. This issue, number 3, starts up with an intro that is very Tank Girl. Multiple world leaders and celebrities talking of world domination and being squashed by a giant frog. Oh, those crazy Aussies. It also features Tanky getting pregnant and a special cameo by Princess Di. And for all of you who believe the truth is out there, check this out. It's that weird face on Mars. This comic has great art that looks like a guy in a mental institution drew it, which is perfect because the writing reflects the same thing. Tank Girl is a truly spastic book that never lacks in entertainment. I give this in-depth look at Australian life 4 Gs on the anti-gravity scale. Lastly, from the land of the rising yen, you're under arrest. Given that the art isn't anything special, you would hope that the book would have a pretty good story, and fortunately, it does. It's about 2 female Japanese police officers who, this time, are in pursuit of a mystery motorcycler. It's a real page-turner with an ending that will give you okotapai, and I don't even know what that means, so it must be good. Manga and anime are tops on my list of comics from foreign lands, so I give this book 4 out of 5 Gs on the anti-gravity scale. Well, that's about it for Comicopia this week. See you next time. Happy travels.
Garth Ennis is an industry leader in the UK comic scene. He's also made a big impact in the US.
I don't tend to think a great deal about the global village in terms of what I'm producing. The ideas come from all over the place, from dreams, from things that I see happen on the street, from a chance remark someone might make, from a person you meet, you might get an instant idea for a character. I find that particularly the kind of stuff I do, which is mostly a sort of a black humor approach to writing comics, to writing fiction, is fairly universal, although not everyone loves it. Any kind of dividing line is not a national one, and a lot of the stuff that I write, I suppose, is inspired by movies and books from both sides of the Atlantic. The comic I'm spending most of my time on at the minute, Preacher, is very heavily Western influenced, and although obviously that's a peculiarly American art form, you'll find there are very few people in Britain, for instance, who didn't watch Westerns and so on growing up, and so can respond to, well, various sort of familiar archetypal images like, you know, the lone gunfighter. Arseface got his name because one of the characters in Preacher simply shouted out, "That fella's got a face like an arse." And I was just amused by the thought of one guy trying to blow his head off, but succeeding only in managing to remove his face, and then having to live with the results, and thus Arseface was born. My personal take on the whole question of violence in comics and extreme situations in comics and so on is that it's not real. It's a fictionalized representation of violence. I'm aware of the difference. I don't like real violence, and I don't go out to, I suppose, promote real violence, but I don't honestly think it's up to me to censor myself for what other people get out of my work. All I can do is do my own work, be as honest as possible in what I write, and put it out there, and then get on to the next project. As for the internet, don't like it. I'm not on it, and I'm convinced that the computers are all going to start talking to one another soon, like in Terminator, and one day all these internet users will find Arnie at the door with a shotgun. So personally, tend to stay well clear.
One comic company that makes a real effort to present a global perspective is Fantagraphics Comics. We caught up with the folks in charge.
I'm Gary Groth. I'm one of the co-founders of Fantagraphics Books, and we started publishing comics in 1976. And what makes us different from other publishers, I think, is that we always wanted to publish the best cartooning we could find, and we wanted to treat artists like authors. and we wanted to publish a broad range of material. Yeah, we published a book called Palestine. It's written and drawn by Joe Sacco, and Joe actually went over to Israel and visited the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, interviewed people, and immersed himself in what was going on over there a few years ago. Made a lot of notes, brought home a lot of tapes, and then transformed that into a long narrative that he wrote and drew. We published a book called Holy Cross that's written by an Irish citizen named Malachi Coney, lives in Belfast. And what he's doing is seriously trying to look at how the politics in Ireland cross-pollinate with the personal lives of the people that it affects over there. So I mean, essentially, you know, our agenda hasn't changed. We're trying to publish the best cartooning we can find by the most mature creative talents we can find.
From the jungles of Rwanda in his travel journal called Comics Trip to the urban jungles from his latest work, The System, Peter Cooper is one artist who has global appeal.
I got started in comics from being interested in comics from when I was a kid, and then just, you know, being a real rabid fan. Comic strips came out of an 8-month trip that my wife and I took through Africa and Southeast Asia. And it was basically my sketchbook. It was really journal entries where I would write something down and then do a picture next to it, and that started to form into basically comics because it's sort of the language that I know. It was like a free-form comic strip. It was a way to communicate with people because I would do a drawing, let's say, and show them, and you know, that was a way to sort of bridge a language gap. Seeing these places in the world that are abstract news items, seeing them up close, you know, sort of when you talk about environmentalism or the rainforest, or, you know, seeing what it is exactly firsthand gives me a greater ability to talk about that rather than just sort of like newsy terms. Well, the system came out of living in New York, and I think I love living here because it's a little bit like traveling all the time. The cross-influence of different cultures and all that. But the seed for the system itself really came from a subway ride where I looked around the train and I wondered, where did all these people come from, and where were they going, and would they run into each other again and influence one another? And that sort of connected to this world, a world view of, you know, seeing it all being associated. And I decided to do it as basically a wordless book. That came out a bit from my travel experience because it is the idea of how to be able to tell these things that you could communicate to people anywhere in the world, give an idea of what it's like here, or, you know, to show things rather than having people say them. It just shows in a lot of ways sort of how broad the possibilities of this medium are.
In South Africa, one comic strip has entertained people and has had a definite effect on the country's politics. We were in the neighborhood, and we got to talk to the creators of Adam and Eve.
Phil, how you doing? I'm Stephen Francis.
And I'm Rico.
And we're coming to you almost live from South Africa. Together we do the most popular cartoon strip in the country, Madam and Eve. The seed was planted about 7 years ago when I first came to this country. I stayed with my new in-laws. I married my wife's South African, who I met in New York City. And while I was staying there, I watched this strange occurrence every day of the madam and the maid interacting. The madam in this case was my own mother-in-law, and the maid was a lady named Florence. I got to know them both pretty well. Especially, and even my mother-in-law. And my mother-in-law would tell me stories about what the maid did. Oh, you wouldn't believe what the maid did today.
Madam and Eve has a lot of political content. It has to have in South Africa because Madam and Eve is social satire, that's how we see it. And in South Africa, the changes and the development, the political process is so all-enveloping that you end up having politics in your cornflakes. It's unavoidable. But also when we set out to do Madam and Eve, we decided that we were we based ourselves loosely on Doonesbury, and we had the same intent as Doonesbury, you know, to create a diary of South African change. That's actually what happened. We didn't set out to do that, but that's actually what happened. If we look over the last 3.5 years of our cartoon strips, you can actually follow the whole political process and the sort of the birth of the new South Africa.
Of course, some of the strips, you have to understand South African politics to get the punchline, but a great many of our strips can be understood by anyone. Humor is universal. As a matter of fact, just a couple days ago, we got our first book from Denmark. Here's Madam and Eve in Danish. I could read some. The cover's called Jamin Sort Kafa Epar Mod Nu, Madam. Of course, I have no idea what that means, but hey, what the heck. I think it means black coffee is in fashion now, Madam. But we're very thrilled, and we hope to see Madam and Eve in a lot more countries, maybe even America soon.
We're gonna dig through that big old mailbag and see what crawls out. So come on back after this.
Aaron Rothman of Ann Arbor, Michigan writes, I love the show so much that I stay home on a Friday night just to see it. Cool. I'm also writing to you about the Phil fan club some friends and I started. Well, Aaron, here's the secret Phil fan club handshake.
So a lot of people wrote back to our survey about who the dumbest superhero was. And it seems the winner is, by a comfortable margin, Matter Eater Lad. Yes, the 1960s Legion of Superheroes member who had the power to, get this, eat and digest any substance. Hoo-hoo. Only the Salisbury steak in the cafeteria slowed this guy down. What a guy.
This week, what we want to know is, which superhero costume is the goofiest?
You can write us at YTV Canada, 64 Jefferson Avenue, Unit 18, Toronto, Ontario, Canada, M6K 3H3, or email us at antigravity@ytv.ca. That's antigravity. And our webpage is at www.antigrav.com.
Well, that's it. Another quick spin around the world.
Yep, the world of comics is always evolving, taking influence from country to country and improving comics globally.
It's hard to believe that someday Howard the Duck might unite the entire world. See you next time on the Anti-Gravity Room.
In search of clues to a shocking murder, a young couple becomes trapped in another dimension, a dark zone of terror where the greatest figures in the annals of horror live on. Waxwork 2, Lost in Time, tonight at 8 p.m. Eastern, Sci-Fi Saturday. From the streets of L.A. to the far reaches of outer space, the hunt is on for the ferocious furballs with a bad case of the